Chapter 8, Conclusion. 8.1, Dissertation Summary. Code-generating AI has disrupted computing education by providing never-before-seen abilities to automate problem-solving in computer programming. Educators have taught students with consistent and refined approaches that stood the test of time through numerous fads and economic circumstances. However, the simultaneous hope, fear, excitement, and grief associated with aids like GitHub Copilot and ChatGPT have left teachers and leaders in education searching for answers about how to best integrate and regulate AI in pedagogy. This dissertation provides much-needed empirical foundations for CS education policy by exploring the AI-assisted programming paradigm and comparing it to traditional programming approaches. To explore the overall research question laid out at the onset of this dissertation, restated below, this work was organized under 4 increasingly focused aims. First, quantitative and qualitative approaches evaluated the use of GitHub Copilot for Python programming against a solo programming control, examined the interaction dynamics and human impacts of GitHub Copilot's presence during time-pressured programming, and modeled a theoretical cycle of trust, compliance, and performance derived from the human factors literature. Second, qualitative explorations critiqued the societal impacts of aids in relation to participants' actual programming experiences, computing education success determinants, histories of identity-based social exclusion, and U.S. economic politics. Third, a mixed methods investigation tested the substitution of a human teammate with Copilot in terms of not just performance, workload, and emotion, but also learning retention. Fourth and finally, the present chapter provides 6 concrete educational recommendations justified by assertive arguments about the findings of the preceding aims. These guidelines, as well as the various contributions revisited in this chapter, have satisfied the original goal of this work to provide evidence-informed guidelines as a foundation for next-generation AI policies in computer science education. As a reminder, the following research question broadly describes the scope of this work. Overall research question: what does studying novice programmers in solo, AI-assisted, and human pair programming paradigms reveal about how computing pedagogy can best promote student success in the age of AI? The points below briefly review the investigations that carried out each of the 4 overarching aims. Note how the scope of work narrowed from wide areas of inquiry to narrow questions with simplified purpose. As the work progressed, the findings of early studies began to clarify that GitHub Copilot was clearly useful and helpful to novices, but concerns began to mount regarding its affective influence. By the time of planning Chapter 7, it was clear that a focus on emotion and learning would be critical to incorporating the overall findings into informed recommendations. Each chapter is noted below, but the empirical investigations are also more thoroughly rehashed in the section that follows. Aim 1. Evaluate and explain human-aid interaction. Chapter 2, Performance, Workload, Emotion, and Self-Efficacy of Novice Programmers Using AI Code Generation, evaluated GitHub Copilot by comparing it directly to solo programming using a within-subjects quantitative experiment. Chapter 3, Novice Interactions with GitHub Copilot Under Time Pressure, a Deductive Qualitative Interview Study, explained how novices use aids under time pressure and how doing so impacts their thoughts and feelings. Chapter 4, Relationships between Trust, Compliance, and Performance for Novice Programmers Using AI Code Generation, provided a quantitative explanation of aid-trust dynamics, bridging between the human automation interaction literature and aid interaction research. Aim 2. Situate human-aid interaction in a societal context. Chapter 5, HBCU Student Perspectives on Identity, Persistence, and Code-Generating AI in CS Education, a case study, examined issues of identity and persistence in relation to code-generating AI by gathering the perspectives of HBCU students after they programmed with Copilot. Chapter 6, Beyond Efficiency, a Critical Political Economy Perspective on AI Code Generators in Computing Education, used critical political economy theories to critique capitalist values that create hazards for computing students in their interactions with aids. Aim 3, Compare human-aid interaction to a social alternative. Chapter 7, Fast and Forgettable, a controlled study of novices' performance, learning, workload, and emotion in AI-assisted and human pair programming paradigms, evaluated GitHub Copilot as a substitute for a human teammate, with particular attention to affective and learning effects. Aim 4, Synthesize findings into computing education recommendations. Chapter 8, this conclusion chapter, brings the preceding chapters 2 to 7 together into actionable takeaways for educators. After a recap of the merit, findings, and impact of each of the empirical investigations, specific educational recommendations for institutional policymakers and classroom teachers are synthesized in Section 8.3. 8.2 Contributions. Though the educational recommendations below are a concrete outcome of this dissertation, the 6 empirical investigations up to this point contributed key foundational research about the human implications of code-generating AI. This section focuses on the intellectual merit and broader impacts of chapters 2 to 7. 8.2.1 Chapter 2 Performance, Workload, Emotion, and Self-Efficacy of Novice Programmers Using AI Code Generation. Overview. This study compared objective performance and subjective measures of workload, emotion, and self-perceived performance between solo and AI-assisted programming conditions to evaluate Copilot for use by CS students. Findings. GitHub Copilot significantly improved programming performance and reduced mental workload and effort, but observed differences were not significant for other dimensions of workload, physical, temporal, performance, frustration, emotion, valence and arousal effects, or self-perceived performance. Between replicates in each condition, however, both actual and self-perceived performance improved significantly for AI trials, but not for solo trials. Intellectual merit. Early research found that AI was effective for a range of programming tasks, but when studies began including human users, the benefits were less clear. Not only did this study cement the performance benefits of aids for novices, it shed light on the uncertain well-being impacts of AI code generators. This human-centric focus has played an integral part in a budding knowledge base on the affective harms of aids compared to traditional paradigms. Broader impacts. Providing quantitative evidence about the two-sided nature of programmer-AI interaction is essential to prevent unfounded policies that are harmful to students. Showing the benefits of aids to performance and workload shows that banned policies are unrealistic for the long term, while reporting inconclusive findings about emotion and self-efficacy can slow overexuberance to adopt aids in CS education. Learning to program has a reputation for being very challenging, so we should take any opportunity to reduce barriers to success. This is especially important for female and racially underrepresented students who can face amplified barriers compared to non-marginalized students. On the other hand, traditional social supports are known to be powerful tools for student success, and the lackluster pseudosocial diversion of generative AI threatens to distract students from these supports. Balancing the productivity benefits of automation with null or negative effects on well-being is also instructive to other types of labor, such as journalism, medical decision-making, and agriculture. 8.2.2 Chapter 3 Novice Interactions with GitHub Copilot Under Time Pressure, a Deductive Qualitative Interview Study. Overview. This study merged a broad review of the qualitative human-aid interaction literature with novel interview data from novice programmers after they programmed in solo and aid-assisted paradigms under time pressure. A set of themes was developed by deduction from existing work and induction from novel findings to describe human-aid interaction, explain it, and reveal its implications on the programmer as a human. Findings. We found that programmers had strong values about how to use aids responsibly and worked strategically and observantly with Copilot, resulting in frequently harmonious interactions. However, participants also fell into aimless, submissive interaction strategies that often caused ineffective collaboration, dispassion, or negative feelings. Intellectual merit. Many prior studies examined programmers using code-generating AI from a human-computer interaction (HCI) perspective. However, these studies often sampled intermediate to advanced programmers and allowed programmers to use aids with no time pressure or basis for comparison. Furthermore, many of these studies arrived at similar findings, but there was a need to cross-reference them for overlapping takeaways. Our study replicated many findings of prior studies, but also diverged to show more maladaptive tendencies. We argue that the focus on novices and the imposition of time pressure bridged beyond the initial novelty of the technology and helped participants articulate some deeper harms of aids in their interviews. Broader impacts. Quantitative research often lacks the nuance of qualitative work with respect to individual differences and potent but uncommon experiences. Negative self-talk, i.e. shame and low self-efficacy, were features of many participants' experiences that were not captured by the conclusions of Chapter 2. Representing these harms, in addition to the loss of metacognitive control we observed, helped to argue against free-for-all AI policies in computing education. It is critical that in adopting automation intended to benefit students, we do not inadvertently expose them to undue emotional harms. It is easy to think that these harms are confined to students or developers, but software production touches nearly every industry. Harming programmers, therefore, threatens to upset a range of production pipelines for numerous essential and life-saving technologies. 8.2.3 Chapter 4 Relationships between Trust, Compliance, and Performance for Novice Programmers Using AI Code Generation. Overview. This study looked at the associations between trust and GitHub Copilot, how much novices used its compliance features, and programming performance. There was an expected cycle starting at trust, leading to rate of compliance, impacting performance, and feeding back to adjustments in trust. Quantitative analysis of these measures over time revealed the extent to which this cycle held up within the experimental context of chapters 2 and 3. Findings. A factor analysis demonstrated the relevance and utility of the Muir Trust Scale for human-aid interaction research. Regression analysis was inconclusive regarding the impact of trust on the number of compliance events, likely due to methodological constraints and a small true effect if present. However, greater compliance was associated with stronger performance, and stronger performance led to higher subsequent levels of trust. Intellectual merit. Substantial work had theorized about cycles of trust, compliance, and performance in the human-automation interaction context. Empirical work has also generally supported a positive feedback cycle from trust to compliance to performance and back to trust. Quantitative trust research in the specific context of human-aid interaction, by contrast, is still in its infancy. Though research in the field suggests that a trust compliance performance cycle could reasonably carry over to programming with AI, we were not aware of any prior quantitative efforts to check. This study provided a foundational look at the role of trust in human-aid interactions that warranted further study into the topic for future researchers. Broader impacts. If trust determines how much programmers use AI and training interventions can influence trust, then educators can design better training materials for optimizing the performance and safety of human AI programming teams. As noted earlier, the ability to produce high-quality software impacts a myriad of real-world contexts, so understanding how to optimize programmers' use of AI is broadly important. Beyond this, though, true performance is easily misinterpreted by common metrics relating to the number of production milestones reached in a given period of time. For example, bugs and security vulnerabilities in code can be missed by such metrics, but can degrade the societal impact of software. Take the case of CVE 2004-0113, a trigger for memory leaks in the extremely popular Apache HTTP web server. The consequence of this bug was that remote attackers could intentionally balloon the memory usage of the application, causing performance degradation and denial of service for legitimate users. As a result, high-stakes web services making use of Apache, such as emergency response or crime reporting systems, could have been threatened by bad actors. Being trained on imperfect human code, GitHub Copilot and other aids can introduce security vulnerabilities like CVE 2004-0113 that may go unnoticed by human programmers. Therefore, exploring whether trust-based or other training interventions can impact the extent to which developers comply with and rely on AI suggestions is critical for preventing seemingly reliable software systems from failing when edge cases and attack vectors come to light. 8.2.4 Chapter 5 HBCU Student Perspectives on Identity, Persistence, and Code-Generating AI in CS Education, a Case Study. Overview. This study collected the perspectives of students at a historically Black college/university to examine personal and computing identity, helpful and harmful contributors to students' success in computing education, and perceptions about how aids might fit into this landscape. Participants shared their perspectives immediately following solo and AI-assisted laboratory programming, so their thoughts were grounded in concrete experiences rather than merely speculation. Findings. Allowed to define their identities however they chose, participants focused mostly on their humanity, for example, curiosity, creativity, and craftsmanship, as well as their desires to have an impact on their peers and the world at large. They found that positive feedback, social support systems, extracurricular learning, and financial aid were helpful to succeeding in CS, while difficult coursework, deficits relative to others, and social barriers were harmful. We determined that AI is helpful for promoting the success of a range of computing students by providing moral support, reducing perceived judgment, and compensating for deficits. is also harmful because it shows students their weaknesses, disrupts their personal identities, interrupts the learning process, and discourages positive social interactions. Intellectual merit. The research community has recognized the value of studying the equity implications of AI code generators, but little work has taken concrete steps to do so. This study made an intentional effort to include the voices of Black students, who are underrepresented in U.S. computing education compared to students of other races. The work also corroborated existing understandings about how to support computing students' academic success overall. With respect to AI, we identified concrete intersections with identity and persistence factors that provide foundational knowledge for educational policymakers. Broader impacts. The impact of this work was giving Black HBCU students a voice in the conversation about code-generating AI in computing education. Frankly, the political climate in the United States at the time this chapter was written was openly hostile to inclusivity-focused research. However, this study demonstrates how pedagogical research that aims to include underrepresented groups leads to universally helpful insights. Most findings from this study were not specific to Black students, though all participants were Black. Just as designing products to be more useful to users with varied physical capabilities begets benefits for all users, designing pedagogy to be inclusive of minoritized students can lead to improvements in educational quality for all students. Readers should not consider Black students to be victims in need of special help from AI compared to non-Black students. Instead, Black students are simply regular participants in computing education who deserve to be included in the conversation about how to be best supported in their educational journeys. It should not be controversial to ensure that a diversity of students inform wide-reaching policies. 8.2.5, Chapter 6, Beyond Efficiency, a Critical Political Economy Perspective on AI Code Generators in Computing Education. Overview. This study used sociological theories of critical political economy and interview data from the studies described in Chapters 2 to 5 to explore and critique the underlying capitalist values borne out in computer science students' experiences programming with GitHub Copilot under time pressure. Findings. We found that participants' values reflected rationalization, the idea that calculable and objective performance measures are better than subjective experiences, and automation bias, an assumption that using Copilot would be more efficient than trying to solve problems themselves. Participants also represented values of individualism, taking personal liability for Copilot's performance, and experienced alienation, being pulled away from enjoyment and social interest by Copilot's presence. Intellectual merit. Social theory is underutilized in computing education research despite many relevant explorations of its pedagogical implications. Sociological scholarship, by contrast, has explored various aspects at education's intersection with labor economics and politics. This study bridges this gap by describing the entanglement of the economic incentives of software production with computing education and code-generating AI. Rather than relying only on theory or speculation, the concrete experiences of novice programmers using GitHub Copilot reveal novel social hazards associated with introducing aids to CS education. Broader impacts. This study challenges common assumptions about the utility of AI in software development and computing education, offering educators alternative perspectives by which to guide their students. The intended political stance is neutral, but naturally resists capitalist thought as a polemic exercise. Offering U.S. laborers alternative narratives about their humanity and purpose helps empower them to stand up for their rights to happiness and welfare. Education has wide-reaching potential to reduce wealth inequality because it recycles desires for working-class citizens to shape the use of AI technology in their own best interests. Automation has displaced and disturbed laborers from other industries in the past, and will continue to do so for unknown industries in the future. The current response of CS educators to AI code generators may well shape the future trajectories of other markets yet to be disrupted. 8.2.6, Chapter 7, Fast and Forgettable, a controlled study of novices' performance, learning, workload, and emotion in AI-assisted and human pair programming paradigms. Overview. Given the accumulation of evidence from the preceding studies that Copilot's help is at least impersonal if not actively antisocial, this study compared it directly to a social human partner. Furthermore, a novel design incentivized participants to balance their programming performance with understanding of their code, which was quantified using an individual retest following a 1-week retention interval. Findings. We found that participants performed significantly better with Copilot compared to their human teammates, and their mental workload, temporal workload, and effort was significantly lower, though frustration differences were inconclusive. Participants' learning retention was not significantly different between conditions, but performance did trend worse on tasks learned with Copilot compared to a human partner. This was especially true for those who were the stronger partner within their human team. Finally, the emotional effects of the programming experiences were significantly more positive and arousing in the human teaming condition compared to the AI-assisted condition. Intellectual merit. Pair programming is recognized as a positive social approach to supporting students through the challenges of learning to code. The introduction of GitHub Copilot and other aids led to a popular notion that AI assistance was comparable or substitutable for human collaboration, supposedly carrying many of the same benefits without the same social and logistical drawbacks. However, when this work was begun, little had experimentally compared the two paradigms. Further investigations have since been published, but they have not shown overall dominance by either paradigm. For example, Reference 82 found participants preferred human tutors for high-stakes questions, and Reference 27 found that a human-human teaming condition and a human-AI teaming condition comparably improved performance over a solo condition, but participants experienced lower social presence with AI. Most importantly, while some of these studies have seen students gain performance benefits on academic assignments from AI, none to our knowledge has compared unassisted retest performance. Broader impacts. The impact of this work is advocacy for preserving human-to-human connection, even as we adopt AI into everyday activities. The results of this study showed clear practical benefits to AI alongside clear emotional benefits to pair programming. Further, the inconclusive effect on learning points to the fact that neither assistance paradigm ought to be used alone. We should introduce code-generating AI in CS education without trying to replace human interactions that have been supporting our well-being for thousands of years. Showing that there are distinct emotional advantages to human-human programming is a reminder to all intellectual laborers that some aspects of their work should probably never be replaced, even if they can be. 8.2.7 Summary. Chapters 2 to 7 described 6 empirical investigations contributing both quantitative and qualitative findings that contributed to the knowledge bases in computer science education, human factors, sociology, and education. Overall, we found that GitHub Copilot is best used by computing students in moderation and in conjunction with social interventions. Aids give clear performance and workload advantages over solo and paired paradigms, but create undeniable harm to students' autonomy and self-perceptions and lack the affective properties of social interactants. The impact of this work extends beyond education policy into software safety, labor rights, educational equity, and general philosophy. 8.3 Educational Recommendations. The culmination of this work is AIM 4, which set out to integrate the findings of AIMs 1 to 3, summarized in section 8.2 above, into straightforward and actionable recommendations for computer science educators. This section sets out 3 concrete approaches to avoid and 3 concrete approaches to embrace. Table 8.1 summarizes these recommendations. The subsections that follow provide examples of each proscription and each suggestion, as well as evidence-informed arguments supporting these recommendations. 8.3.1 Approaches to avoid. Extrapolating from the findings of this dissertation and those of related research in the field, this section provides cautions against policy approaches that are likely to work against fairness and the best interest of students. Such approaches include overly conservative or liberal policies, especially when accompanied by weak justifications provided by educators to students in a one-way, top-down manner. Avoid ban policies and forced guardrails. Examples. Ban policies are restrictions at the classroom or institutional level which prohibit students from either using certain features of Gen AI, such as code generation, or disallow Gen AI use entirely. This also includes well-intentioned policies that pass judgment on certain modes of AI use, such as, quote, "It is okay to use AI tools to explain concepts, but you may not use them to replace critical thinking," end quote. Tools with guardrails, for example, reference 64, 56, and 66, fall into this category unless students are expressly allowed to use commodity tools as well, making their guardrails optional. Argument. Prohibition policies slow society's overall pace of adaptation to AI innovation and are unlikely to be followed. They also create moral hazards for students, cause inconsistencies between settings with and without such policies, and miss opportunities to promote student success and educational equity. Tools with guardrails offer students agency to choose adaptive patterns over maladaptive ones, but mandating overly restrictive guardrails will simply drive students to covertly use general-purpose aids. Evidence. AI offers clear benefits to programming performance that neither students nor their future employers will be able to ignore. Banning AI entirely is both unrealistic and out of touch with the reality in which computing students live. In Chapter 2, we showed that GitHub Copilot significantly improved novices' programming performance compared to solo programming. And in Chapter 7, we showed Copilot was also more helpful to participants' programming performance than human teammates. Chapters 2 and 7 also showed significant differences from control in several non-emotional workload dimensions, indicating that Copilot reduced the difficulty of programming compared to both solo and human-human pair programming paradigms. In Chapter 4, we found a significant positive relationship between compliance to Copilot's suggestions and programming performance, meaning Copilot can offer increasing benefits as users accept its help more readily. We also know from Chapters 3 and 6 that students have core intentions to use AI responsibly, but need support to stay out of tempting over-reliance traps. As discovered in Chapters 2 and 3, using aids effectively is an acquired skill and not one students can be assumed to have naturally. Based on the economic imperatives focused on in Chapter 6, students will most likely be expected to use aids in their careers. Therefore, it's critical to teach students how to harness the clear utility of AI code generation technology rather than assuming that other benefits of traditional paradigms can outweigh the massive performance benefit of using AI to one's advantage. One major disadvantage to mandating guardrails against code generation is that it leaves students unprepared to use code generators in their careers. Finally, the findings of Chapters 3 and 5 emphasize that aids act as learning resources and moral supports to students as they progress through the challenging aspects of computing education. Prohibiting their use stands to harm struggling students most, as strong students are poised to succeed regardless of the rules they must navigate. Doing so also worsens educational inequity because though students at a given institution or in a given course may all be subject to the same restrictions, those in other courses or at other institutions with more liberal policies will gain a competitive edge in the labor market. Furthermore, as noted in Chapter 5, using AI assistance as an educational accommodation is an opportunity to level the playing field for students with unique disadvantages like mental illnesses or lack of access to education and technology during primary and secondary education. Avoid free-for-all policies and ambiguity. Examples. Free-for-all policies are implied by a lack of relevant policy and also include explicit policies allowing students to use code-generating AI for any purpose. They also include policies such as, quote, "You may use AI to support you in any way, but you must submit an explanation and reflection on how you used AI for any given assignment that includes transcripts of your conversations with AI," end quote. Ambiguous policies are those that, intentionally or unintentionally, are vague enough to be open to interpretation. For example, the policy, quote, "only use AI in ways that will support your learning," end quote, will leave students questioning what they are and are not allowed to do. Argument. Free-for-all policies expose students to risks associated with heavy AI usage, and ambiguity creates confusion. Students may lack awareness of their true competence if they're always using AI assistance, and their capability to perform may be diminished if aids underperform or become unavailable. Ambiguous policies and additional assignment components seem like they hedge against unforeseen AI harms, but they ultimately sow confusion and discontent, disproportionately punishing the most honest students. Evidence. Our findings suggest that AI's strong performance benefit is ephemeral, fading when the assistance is removed, but its harms have broader reach. In both Chapters 2 and 7, programmers performed worse alone and in teams with other humans than they did with Copilot. In Chapter 7, when we attempted to compare the learning effect of Copilot to that of a human teammate, the result was inconclusive but trended toward being worse with AI. Though our work did not attempt to compare students' perceptions of competence to their actual competence, prior work has suggested that AI deludes students into thinking they are more knowledgeable than they really are. While it is unclear whether AI is better or worse for learning than traditional paradigms, other harms we identified point to overly permissive policies being hazardous. Chapters 2, 3, and 5 to 7 showed that Copilot brought a fresh perspective and vast knowledge base that would clearly contribute to learning. However, it also lacked emotional resonance, robbed programmers of their autonomy, interrupted their personal identities, drew them away from social help seeking, and encouraged negative self-talk. These harms are enough to dissuade free-for-all policies in favor of hybrid policies that permit the use of code-generating AI in some circumstances, but not others. Another consideration is AI access. Participants in Chapter 5 reported unwillingness to pay for aids as long as relatively comparable free alternatives exist. These students, studying at a state university, with some having been raised in poor families lacking technology access, may have different thresholds for limiting costs as compared to other students. As an example, the pricing tiers for ChatGPT currently range from $0 to $200 per month. For a wealthy student hoping to gain an advantage, the top tier price may be negligible. Just as standardized test preparation courses, fencing lessons, private tutoring, or Chegg subscriptions might provide wealthy families opportunities to give their children educational advantages, premium AI can do the same. If an institution or instructor chooses not to address code-generating AI or take a stand on how they prefer their students to use it, they risk a massive gap forming between students with high AI access and those with low AI access. By contrast, encouraging students to use tools freely available to all of them gives a more even distribution of the potential advantages among students from different backgrounds. Our findings also suggest that pairing free-for-all policies with AI usage reflections is insufficient as a policy response. Chapter 5 delves into what makes it hard to persist in computer science education at the post-secondary level. Two major challenges are the difficulty, or at least perceived difficulty, of coursework and lack of applicability, or perceived applicability, to real-world problems. Due to the tendencies observed in Chapters 3, 5, and 6 for programmers to fall into mindless and submissive roles with GitHub Copilot, having students reflect on their AI usage is likely to help them regain metacognitive control. However, pairing this technique with a free-for-all policy creates similar moral hazards to a ban policy. A dishonest student seeking to earn high grades as easily as possible becomes incentivized to complete work with AI assistance, but present the work as unassisted to avoid the extra effort required to produce an AI reflection. Once again, honest students will be penalized with what is arguably, quote, busy work, end quote, increasing the difficulty of completing coursework without having much applicability to a real-world activity. Because of the economic incentives described in Chapter 6, employers are not likely to allow time for such reflection opportunities, let alone require them. A potential solution is to pair reflection activities with AI-required assignments, where all students must do the activity because all were required to use AI for it. In this case, honest students do not face the same disadvantages. In summary, reflections have strong potential, but pair poorly with free-for-all policies. Avoid banal and anachronistic policy justifications. Examples. Some educators will feel pressure to educate their students about AI, but will not have the time, knowledge, or willingness to engage in nuanced discussions on the topic. A banal or trite warning to students might go like, quote, AI can be helpful, but you always have to check it because it makes mistakes, end quote. An anachronistic, i.e. outdated or temporally restricted, caution would focus on limitations of the current time, or a past time, failing to acknowledge how innovation has or could change the validity of the caution in the future. For example, saying, quote, ChatGPT produces more memory leaks in C code than human programmers, end quote, could be true at a given time, but cease to be true in the future. Any argument discouraging use of ChatGPT on this account would then be invalidated by such a change. Argument. Lazy cautions against code-generating AI are worse than no cautions at all. Students are capable of having refined discussions on the harms and benefits of AI. Policy justifications should rest on timeless truths or up-to-date knowledge rather than hackneyed warnings lacking in depth or basis in fact. Evidence. Qualitative analyses in Chapters 3, 5, and 6 show that students hold strong moral convictions about how to responsibly use AI code generators, but their behavior can diverge from these convictions. The sociological critique in Chapter 6 details the political-economic roots of participants' positioning of AI within their concepts of the labor process. Participants felt liable for the failings of AI but would not take credit for its success. See also chapters 2, 3, and 7. Sometimes, as noted in chapters 3 and 5, participants misunderstood AI as being an expert, authority, or database of facts. Telling students that AI is imperfect is not enough to reconstruct these misperceptions. Rather, students deserve thoughtful education about the philosophical underpinnings of their involvement in the software development process. Chapter 1 argues in section 1.2 why we ought to continue to educate computer scientists in the age of AI. Chapter 6 further challenges the artifacts in students' thought patterns of outdated or politically biased paradigms for responsibility in the world of computing. Overall, our findings suggest that the basic premise that computer scientists need to exist must be justified for students early in post-secondary programs. Simply warning of potential misdirection or problems in the media will leave students without appropriate focus on the creative, value-centric, and communal ideals they need for fruitful careers in the modern day. 8.3.2 Approaches to Embrace. The following suggested approaches are based on the body of work in this dissertation, which also draws on dozens of prior studies in the field. See sections 1.4 and 8.2. Findings support a partial adoption approach, where students are encouraged, not forced, to curtail their AI use while still using it in clearly defined cases. Co-creating policies with instructors who can facilitate discussion about the deeper purposes for regulation allows students to dial up the restrictiveness of their own policies to meet their collective learning objectives. These recommendations are also informed by the teaching experiences of the author, who has found that students who have agency in the classroom rulemaking process are more satisfied with those rules over time. Embrace self-imposed guardrails and accessible alternatives. Examples. Self-imposed guardrails are decisions made by students about which AI tools and features to use, as well as customizations to those AI tools that change how they work. For example, while the CS50 Duck Debugger has instructor-provided guardrails against code generation, students given the option to use ChatGPT over the Duck can still make a conscious decision toward the safer option on their own. Customizations might include Copilot's snooze feature, which turns off inline code completion for 5 minutes, or Copilot's instructions feature, which lets users tell Copilot about their background or provide general instructions for how it should behave in chat conversations. Within instructions files, students could describe their programming experience, their language background, their learning goals, and ask Copilot not to include complete code examples in chat responses. This way, when working on AI-inclusive assignments, students can learn how to mold their AI's behavior to their current goals rather than relinquishing control over the interaction trajectory. Accessible alternatives are ways to attract AI-agnostic help seeking, such as internet searching, pair programming with peers, office hours with teaching assistants, and instructor-led review sessions. Instructors should be looking for ways to make non-AI-based help seeking so effortless and fruitful that students are least attracted to use AI in times of crisis. For example, many post-secondary programming courses include laboratory sections that instructors can use to build scheduled pair programming into students' weekly routines. Additionally, making course resources like lecture slides and example code easily accessible and clear to understand gives alternatives to AI as a default. Argument. Computing pedagogy must gently nudge students toward adaptive learning interactions with AI code generators. Dictating how students should use AI leaves them out of the conversation and disregards their own extant morality. If instructors want students to use AI in certain ways or avoid it altogether, they should make those behaviors extremely attractive and as effortless as possible. Evidence. One major finding of Chapter 3 was the tendency for novices to fall mindlessly into maladaptive behaviors with AI, in line with prior work. Deep down, participants desired to learn and had no malicious intent overall. See also Chapter 6. They simply felt drawn into concerning patterns by time pressure and a lack of metacognitive awareness. The takeaway is that adaptive student behaviors need to be made so seamless as to be practically unavoidable. If resorting to ChatGPT seems easier or more preferable than an instructor's recommended approach, students will undoubtedly go that route. Just as adding extra optional steps for AI users under laissez-faire policies encourages dishonesty, encouraging students to use AI with guardrails imposed by the instructor conflicts with student agency and buy-in. Students need to choose guardrails because they want them, not because they are required. Furthermore, there needs to be instructional time dedicated to teaching students how to control AI tools, rather than assuming they will invest that time on their own. GitHub Copilot has a broad and ever-changing set of features that most users never even try. As we found in Chapter 3, salient user interface elements dominate human perception and guide behaviors toward the most obvious features. The findings of Chapter 2 and 3 showed that participants took time to learn how to collaborate with Copilot effectively. If students are expected to write system prompts for Copilot, turn off code completion in certain situations, and maintain agency in conversations with ChatGPT, they must be trained on how to do so. It is also critical that instructor-provided AI tooling is always as good or better than off-the-shelf tooling. There should be clear explanation provided for students about how and why a bespoke tool can be more useful for them than a commodity option. Otherwise, because of the pressures described in Chapter 5, they will simply drift back to a superior alternative in times of crisis. In summary, guardrails and AI alternatives have their place, but students must choose them naturally and not by force. Embrace layered coursework. Charge, challenge, check. Examples. Charge, challenge, check, introduced here, is a suggested approach to the coursework in a computing course that employs 3 levels of AI usage for assignments, i.e., coursework layering. Instructors should strive to use all 3 layers to some degree within each course, based on students' collective learning objectives. At one end of the spectrum, charge activities should give students free license to use AI for a maximum productivity effect. For example, students might use aids to plan, produce, and test a complex application in a short time frame. In the middle, challenge activities glorify slowness and reward students for displaying authority over AI tools, critiquing assumptions and details, and revisiting sloppily produced code bases. Examples include required engagements with AI to interrogate algorithms or identify security vulnerabilities in code with known issues. Both charge and challenge require students to be given access to best-in-class tools, including mid-tier premium options for which institutions can purchase subscriptions at scale. This is no different from library subscriptions to academic journals or licenses purchased to give students experience with 3D modeling software. At the far end, check assignments go back to the basics, testing students on the skills and knowledge they retain for unassisted scenarios. This could be anything from paper tests to proctored individual programming assignments to interviews with instructors. Argument. Far extremes are usually worse than hybrid approaches. Charge, challenge, check rests on the assumption that humans should have some ability to solve problems and write code without AI assistance, but that using AI to its fullest advantage is also a professional duty. The intermediate space is driven by philosophical ideals that challenging extremes and engaging in deliberate slowness are beneficial to society and the human experience. Evidence. As mentioned in section 8.3.1, there are legitimate reasons to avoid both outright bans of AI technologies and complete policy agnosticism. Participants' subjective reports in chapters 3, 5, and 6 show that students are wary of the harms and temptations of aids, while simultaneously realizing their historical significance and utility in software development. Because of the economic and political systems discussed in Chapter 6, each new generation of computing students has the power to perpetuate or change norms about how AI should be used in the software industry. However, the clear performance benefits of AI code generators reported in Chapters 2, 4, and 7 are too strong to be ignored, so sheltering students while they're in school will not likely have its intended effect. Refusing charge assignments not only leaves students unprepared for skill sets their employers want them to have, it also means they will make their first mistakes using AI as a labor accelerant in the much higher stakes environments of the real world. Leaving out the check component may lead to an overconfident workforce unequipped for the inevitable complications associated with imperfect automation reliability. Chapter 7 showed that solo programming assignments can ground programmers back to reality regarding what they really know versus what they think they know. Finally, Chapters 3 and 5 solidified the benefits of aids for teaching, exploring new ideas, and providing moral support in CS education. In Chapter 6, we discussed how centering student autonomy and challenging assumptions about the inherent value of speed and productivity can complement these benefits and avoid harmful metacognitive and psychological disruptions. Overall, layering pedagogy into distinct buckets with clear rules that cover a comprehensive range of approaches is an antidote to the confusion and moral hazards warned about in Section 8.3.1. Embrace policy co-creation and timeless justifications. Examples. Co-creation is the process of including students in the policy design process instead of deciding what is best on their behalf. As part of this endeavor, educators can guide discussions with students toward timeless moral and philosophical arguments they may not have come up with on their own. Timeless justifications are those that hold up regardless of the technical limitations of the day. These are necessary when enforcing any level of restriction from the educator's side of co-creation to secure student buy-in. Timeless justifications for charge, challenge, check coursework include the importance of developers' happiness and enjoyment in their work, communal responsibility for software safety, and considering environmental and quality-related externalities of hastily produced code. Argument. Policy co-creation based in non-technical, open discussions with students is the remedy for out-of-touch, tired warnings that justify AI resistance with shaky logic. Students will be better educated by inclusion in efforts toward responsible use of aids. Students will still create sufficiently restrictive policies to protect themselves, but will increase the practical relevance of education policy to everyday learning activities. Evidence. Chapters 3 and 6 revealed that novice programmers feel substantial moral obligations to use AI carefully and protect their ability to learn. However, as argued in chapters 5 and 6, aids trigger students to feel apathy and discontent with their involvement in the software development process. Realizing that AI can effortlessly replace many of the skills you so proudly develop as a computer science student is disheartening. There needs to be an open dialogue between students and educators about the new fears AI-based programming automation introduces. Those fears must be validated but also challenged through deeper discussions about what justifies continued human involvement in this industry. Co-creation draws on the visceral vulnerability of students facing this new career landscape. Drawing from research in the realm of public health, the acceptability of different COVID-19 response interventions varied widely across demographics of age and health status. Therefore, if older adults created policies they found acceptable, they risked young people disagreeing with the policies and thus failing to adhere. Similarly, if a generation of educators creates policies reflecting the norms and pressures of their time, they risk writing regulations that misalign with students' active needs. Stepping back, the findings in Chapter 7 stress how AI resistance can promote developer well-being. The participants there were happier to work harder and perform worse with human teammates over Copilot. To assume that students will not realize their own deep-seated preferences for human connection sells them unfortunately short. The findings of Reference 27 further support this claim. They found the human-human paradigm led to a greater sense of collaboration and social presence compared to the human AI or solo human paradigms. Capitalistic obsession with productivity distracts from the inherent need for laborers to feel excited to exist and work. If aids cause us more suffering than they avoid, their adoption is frivolous. Allowing students to take this stand and advocate for their own preservation is thus a strong approach for AI regulation. 8.4 Limitations. This section discusses some of the key limitations of this work with respect to internal, external, and construct validity. Additional discussion of limitations and threats to validity is provided in the preceding chapters, but the overarching caveats are investigated here. 8.4.1 Threats to internal validity. The internal validity of this work is the extent to which the reported evidence accurately represents causal conclusions made about our samples of 17, 10, and 22 participants under the conditions created in the laboratory. Qualitative trustworthiness. In the case of chapters with qualitative components, chapters 3 and 5 to 7, internal validity is threatened by our human limitations and biases as researchers. Rather than attempting to neutralize our biases, we acknowledge their presence and embrace the breadth of our qualitative data rather than trying to over-systematize it. The narrow scope of what one group of researchers can read, know, or consider is biologically constrained. To mitigate threats to the validity of our findings, we took several steps. First, having multiple researchers participate in the analysis process helped to challenge singular perspectives of this dissertation's author. Across chapters, more than 10 individuals participated in the interpretation of qualitative datasets. Second, heavy reliance on prior qualitative work situated the findings against broader perspectives from the research community. Third, direct quoting was used in all qualitative analyses to share directly the voices of participants without modification. Fourth, deliberate balancing was performed to counteract unintentional, quote, cherry picking, end quote, of only perspectives that fit a particular narrative. For example, in chapters 3 and 5, quote counts were tallied throughout the analysis process to prevent talkative interviewees from dominating the results, or potent but infrequently shared ideas from being missed. Overall, though the narrative presented in this dissertation regarding qualitative data is surely biased, we encourage future researchers to further explore and interrogate our data. 4 ethical review processes were performed as part of this dissertation under the protocol numbers UVA IRB SBS 5614, Phase 1, reviewed by University of Virginia IRB for Social and Behavioral Sciences, and Phase 2, reviewed by UVA SBS and the Virginia State University IRB, and UVA IRB SBS 7557, reviewed by UVA SBS. Both protocols, 5614 and 7557, explicitly allow outside researchers to request permission from the investigators for anonymized copies of empirical data for further research purposes. This provides a final, ongoing source of trustworthiness for the honesty of our qualitative work. To seek access to this data, please search for up-to-date institutional contacts for the author of this dissertation and his principal investigator, who is listed as his graduate advisor on the approval page in the front matter. Statistical validity. This dissertation made heavy use of inferential statistics, i.e. hypothesis testing, to support claims about the effects of GitHub Copilot and the associations of various measures of interest. Even if the measures and experimental design were valid, type 1 errors, i.e. false positive significance, or type 2 errors, i.e. false negative significance, are common. Our small samples make these concerns especially important because parametric frequentist statistics rely on samples being sufficiently large to converge toward a correct answer, even if the observations are not perfectly in line with the truth. Several approaches were used to counteract these challenges. In Chapter 2, which tested the effect of Copilot compared to a solo control and the effect of time, being on the second trial replicate rather than the first, within each condition, simple paired comparisons, aggregated when necessary, were made. Rather than naively using the paired t-test, which relies on a number of assumptions for valid inference, these assumptions were checked, and the least conservative reasonable test was used among a group of 3 increasingly conservative options. We hope this prevented type 1 errors, but it did risk producing type 2 errors by deflating p-values. For example, temporal workload, how rushed the participants felt, was lower by a non-statistically significant margin in Chapter 2. However, when including unpublished data collected in a similar manner from the participants in Chapter 5, that measure seems to cross the significance threshold, changing the overall conclusion. Different explanations, like differences between the cohorts and data collection circumstances, might explain this, but sample size is another very plausible explanation. With more consequential measures like emotional valence and arousal, the conclusions did not seem to change. Nonetheless, it is always possible that with large enough sample sizes, any extant effects can become recognized as significant effects, even if small or practically insignificant. In Chapters 4 and 7, we used more advanced inference techniques centered around linear regression, generalized estimating equations, and wild cluster bootstrapping. These trade off simplicity and ease of justification with a greater balance between under and over rejection risks with respect to statistical hypotheses. As is the case with any analysis, it is possible to influence the outcome by choosing a method which leads to a result the researcher wishes to see. In the choice of these methods, we attempted to ensure that multiple reasonable approaches to solving the statistical problems we had all generally arrived at similar conclusions. Another issue with statistical conclusions is over-reliance on p-values, especially without consideration of the multiple comparison problem. The issue is that significance thresholds, such as our commonly used alpha equals 0.05, strive to reduce the incidence of type 1 error to 5%. This means that the expected number of wrong significant answers is 1 per 20 positive p less than 0.05 tests. Careful readers can revisit Chapters 2, 4, and 7 to estimate how many of the significant results discussed might reasonably be incorrect. The famous, or perhaps infamous, Bonferroni correction balloons p-values by a simple heuristic that then creates problems of type 2 error. A middle ground is a correction like Benjamini-Hochberg, which controls the false discovery rate at 100 alpha% as intended. This approach was taken in Chapter 7. One might wonder why no p-value corrections were performed in Chapters 2 and 4. The answer comes down to a technicality about the nature of the questions being asked. If a researcher sets out hypotheses about a number of individual metrics in advance, as done in Chapters 2 and 4, it is reasonable not to adjust p-values unless a question can be answered by the significance of a singular sub-item. NASA TLX workload is a perfect example because it is a 6-item scale that attempts to measure one overarching construct, workload. In Chapter 2, our method corresponds to hypothesizing about each dimension on its own. We found that mental demand was lower with Copilot, for example, but did not use that as evidence to conclude that physical demand or overall workload was lower. By contrast, in Chapter 7, we selected a subset of measures of interest and performed p-value corrections across that family of tests. This means that any one of our 3 significant findings could be individually indicative of some difference in the aggregate workload represented by this group of 4 items, although we did not choose to make such a definitive conclusion. By contrast, if we had collected 100 random measures and observed a difference in a handful of them without any pre-made reasoning or expectations, it would then be inappropriate to interpret sub-alpha p-values as significant unless we had also performed a correction across all 100 tests. In summary, we attempted to balance the risks of type 1 and type 2 error with respect to inferential statistics, but other metrics like the central tendencies of the data or the calculated effect size can further elucidate the strength of the quantitative findings from Chapters 2, 4, and 7. Endogeneity. Endogenous influences, those produced from within, threaten to influence our results through measurement error, omitted variables, and reverse causality. Sources of measurement error in our quantitative measures were inconsistencies between sets of tasks and variability in participants' understanding and interaction with subjective scales. Even if the task pools were somewhat exchangeable, such that there was no systematic difference in their difficulty, certain properties of tasks could have created noise in the data. For example, a programming task that requires knowledge of trigonometry might have greatly variable difficulty between individuals with different backgrounds in mathematics. Even if we were able to know for sure that this was true, collecting a measure with which to control for this factor would be very hard, if not impossible. Subjective scales are also inherently prone to measurement error. A participant can click down the center of a page of Likert bubbles mindlessly, or even misread a question by accident. By instructing participants carefully and using validated or simple scales, we hope that statistical methods were able to wash out these sources of error. Omitted variables might include factors for the task pools or time. In Chapter 7, we specifically checked for endogeneity, but in Chapters 2 and 4, we relied instead on counterbalancing and statistical methods to overcome this source of error. For example, by distributing the assignment of task pools, orderings, and assignments of the treatment, any systematic differences in our metrics of interest owing to these factors should have been mixed up to where they would not produce spurious results. Reverse causality was probably most concerning in Chapter 4, where associations between compliance and performance were statistically significant. While trust to compliance and performance to trust relationships could be thought of in causal terms based on the chronological ordering of measurement incidents, it is not entirely valid to conclude that compliance to Copilot suggestions caused greater performance. An alternative explanation is that higher performers just happened to be more open to taking suggestions because, for example, they knew they could perform well either way. Though the laboratory studies in this dissertation took careful steps to counteract endogeneity, readers should still interpret our findings with these caveats in mind. 8.4.2 Threats to external validity. The external validity of this work is the extent to which any internally valid findings generalize beyond our samples into contexts of practical importance. This work mostly aims to inform computing education, so this is the most important context in which to be valid. Practitioners or professional software developers may also draw from this dissertation, so industrial programming is also relevant. Ecological validity. A common criticism of the empirical work presented in this dissertation is that human eval tasks are not generalizable to real-world educational or industrial programming tasks. Critics will point to their simplicity, well-defined requirements and acceptance criteria, and use for benchmarking LLMs. All of these factors, we agree, make human eval tasks easier for GitHub Copilot than some theoretically, quote, average real-world task. Nonetheless, this criticism distracts from the real questions that this dissertation answered about the performance benefits of Copilot. Whether Copilot was reliable for the tasks at hand was not of interest, but rather whether novice and intermediate programmers were capable of harnessing this reliability to their benefit, for performance, for learning, or for general well-being. This goal will surely age poorly, as the obvious ease of obtaining such benefits will undoubtedly become even more clear in the years to follow 2026. Let this note serve as a reminder for future scholars that 2022, when this work was first envisioned, was a much more uncertain time in this regard. As silly as it may sound, few could say confidently at that time whether or not novices were ready to use AI for programming. Another fair criticism of Chapter 2, which is addressed therein, is the lack of internet access in the control condition, something that reemerged in different forms after modifying subsequent study designs. Participants at VSU, see Chapter 5, were allowed to use the internet, but other unexpected controls ended up being needed for consistency there too. For example, participants could not be permitted to message friends online or use ChatGPT in the browser, since our data collection system was unprepared for such choices. Some participants were even refused requests for scratch paper and permission to review their own nearby notebooks. By the time of Chapter 7, Google had begun including AI search overviews above nearly every set of returned internet search results. To restrict the use of AI to Copilot, therefore, this commonplace feature had to be disabled. Every one of these restrictions represents a trade-off between internal validity and external validity. What serves to scientifically isolate a treatment risks also to diverge far enough from regular behavior as to make the resulting answers useless in practice. In a naturalistic study, programmers would be expected to exhibit wide variance in their help-seeking behaviors. Only with a very large quantity of data could this additional noise be expected to allow treatment effects to show through appropriately. Lastly, the incentive and risk structures in the solo versus AI-assisted design were potentially problematic. As noted, particularly in Chapters 2 to 4 and 6, participants in the first study design, the 17 at UVA and the 10 at VSU, were incentivized with money to perform as many tasks as they could by whatever means necessary. They were also given pre-written unit tests from human eval as acceptance criteria for their work. This meant that 1, they were perfectly equipped with feedback cycles to minimize the risk of using Copilot, and 2, they were actively encouraged not to focus on learning in the interest of saving valuable time. The discussion of Chapter 4 delves deeper into the importance of Point 1 in relation to trust. As for Point 2, this clearly biased participants toward using Copilot in maladaptive ways, which was a major finding of our work. This logic may seem circular or contrived, but, as discussed at length in Chapter 6, productivity is an ecologically valid incentive for software developers in industry. Even in educational settings, students often take assessments under time pressure and work on programming projects with definitive deadlines. We argue that seeing how students acted when placed under such an incentive structure is an essential contribution to the overall knowledge base. However, to make better consideration of the trade-off between immediate performance and learning retention, the second study design, introduced in Chapter 7, incentivized a balance between the two by lying to participants, ethically. We believe this strategy was effective. One participant's response after debriefing was, quote, "That's genius," end quote, reflecting that the financial incentive drove him to prioritize learning exactly as intended. Overall, the studies in this dissertation created conditions where some of the most concerning tendencies were bound to arise, but that does not completely invalidate their generalizability. Sampling. It is important to generalize findings cautiously when considering the small, convenient samples taken for this work. The best mitigation to offer in this case is information about the participants that readers can use to situate the results against other groups of people. Because these studies attempted to collect rich and ambitious datasets, they were long and complex for participants to get involved with. They involved many planning steps and a large time commitment, restricting the likelihood that busy students, those with weak executive functioning skills, or those with limitations due to transportation or other factors would participate. The properties of the 49 total participants are discussed at greater length throughout the preceding chapters, but many of them were Asian and Black, with Hispanic, Latinx, and Indigenous participants being poorly represented. There was a reasonable representation of both male and female participants, but gender nonconforming participants were not common. At most, one participant who chose not to share their gender may have been non-binary. Though several international students were recruited at VSU, see Chapter 5, they were by no means a representative sample of the world population. Overall, the sample of 39 UVA students and 10 VSU students reflects 2 public research universities in Virginia, USA, and the demographics of highly organized students who attend them. 8.4.3 Threats to Construct Validity. Construct validity is the extent to which our data effectively measured what we hoped to explore. For qualitative data, a threat to construct validity is the choice of questions, the wording of those questions, and the interviewing style. For more information about these choices, refer to the methodology of chapters 3 and 5 to 7. For workload, our methodologies chose not to consider the 6 dimensions of the NASA TLX as a single construct, but rather as 6 individual dimensions. This approach contrasts with the creator's intended use for the scale, but requires fewer assumptions about the mathematical relationships between the items. Emotion was measured with the Russell valence versus arousal model using intuitive Likert scales. However, emotion can be described in many different ways, including categorically rather than dimensionally. The covariance of emotional valence and arousal raises further questions about how many emotion dimensions participants can really distinguish. For example, one can feel strong positive valence or weak positive valence, but then also feel a higher or lower level of arousal at either of those valence levels. Arguably, it's confusing to present different ways to quantify the intensity of emotions on the same reporting instrument. Greater attention to these psychometric questions is beyond the scope of this research. In Chapter 4, factor analysis and retest reliability tests were performed specifically to scrutinize the construct validity of measures for trust. Finally, quantifying performance and learning is inherently challenging. Here, we considered only the ability to write code that passed unit tests with various levels of assistance. More complete measures of performance might consider code complexity, security vulnerabilities, or runtime speed. Measures for learning could account for conceptual understanding or the ability to explain the purpose or logic behind a given code snippet. 8.5 Future Work. In addition to several calls for future work throughout the chapters 2 to 7, future research should explore 1. How to make the educational recommendations contributed here practical to implement, 2. To what extent different tools with guardrails are effective at promoting learning, and 3. How to combine the benefits of human-human pair programming and AI assistance. Section 8.3 argues for 3 policy approaches to avoid and 3 to embrace for the responsible use of AI code generators in computer science education, providing concrete examples for clarity. However, educators are often plagued by limitations on their time and ability to make curricular changes. Many university professors minted over the past decade may have just recently confined the labor of teaching computer science to a reliable and repeatable recipe just as AI came into vogue. There's a natural desire to resist AI for the simple reason that revising pedagogical approaches is too hard. Rarely does a curriculum improve as a result of a singular sweeping redesign. Instead, incremental changes over time are realistic ways to move toward better education systems. Instructors are in dire need of resources to support the transition to the proposed charge challenge check coursework approach. From ways to take attendance to easily proctored assessments to AI code critique assignments, free and open source curricular options will be essential for ensuring that all computing students can reap the benefits of AI. Section 1.4.4 introduced some of the early options showing how to restrict Gen AI in ways designed to protect students. In the interest of making sure educational interventions are evidence-informed, it is crucial that guardrails be empirically evaluated for effectiveness. There is logic behind the hypothesis that code generation, for example, is a dangerous capability for student programmers aiming to learn. However, as argued in sections 8.3.1 and 8.3.2, there are inequity challenges that can result from inappropriately imposed restrictions on commonplace AI technology. Even if guardrails are self-imposed by students, they should be supporting rather than hindering learning. A classroom setting would be ideal to study guardrails. Researchers should evaluate not only code generation guardrails, but perhaps novel ones related to metacognition, problem decomposition, documentation, testing, or other factors. Lastly, there's a need to study the effects of AI code generators in different human team formats. This dissertation compared the human-AI paradigm to the solo paradigm and the human-human team paradigm, but future investigations should compare the human-human AI paradigm to the human-human and human-AI paradigms. Reference 68 took important first steps in this direction, but it remains to be seen if the affective benefits of human teammates can coexist with the performance benefits of aides, as well as where learning fits into that equation. Practitioners and educators alike will need informed recommendations for how to support an optimal balance between effective assistance and human control if AI is to be added to social programming teams. Controlled laboratory research will be integral to better understanding these hybrid intelligence programming paradigms. 8.6. Closing thoughts. On its surface, this dissertation appears to be about artificial intelligence, but it is really about humans. The 49 individuals who participated in this research put the evidence in evidence-informed systems engineering and gave meaning to the work. The key takeaway from this work is that the value of human connection is irreplaceable by artificial intelligence. In Chapter 2, Copilot failed to show an emotional benefit, despite its strong productivity support. Chapters 3 and 6 showed novices were especially susceptible to Copilot dominating interactions, robbing them of the control and ownership over their work that they wanted. The results from Chapters 4 and 5 revealed how Copilot's assistance draws programmers in, encouraging them to trust it more and become distracted from fruitful social alternatives. However, the findings of Chapter 7 failed to show a learning benefit that matched Copilot's initial performance boost. More importantly, participants gained much stronger emotional benefits from human programming partners. In 2022, the robots were coming. See reference 29. In 2023, the robots got here. See reference 86. In 2026, the robots have not yet replaced us. However, if we want them to, they probably can soon. We can give Copilot a voice, a face, a body, a charming laugh, or anything else that brings it closer from artificiality to authenticity. This dissertation has begun to explain how, without these things, AI has much to offer student programmers, but pales in comparison to authentic human partners. As the next generation of designers considers this gap and how to close it, they ought to consider whether perhaps some roles are left best filled by us humans.